There are women who enter the world through silken curtains and gilded doors. And then there are those who arrive through the kitchen, the alley, or not at all women, whose names were never supposed to echo through palaces, much less history. Jeanne Bécu belonged to the second kind. She was not meant to be remembered. And yet, here we are 2.5 centuries later, whispering her name in the stillness of night. Like a secret, someone tried to bury under lace and scandal. She was born in the spring of 1743, in a place where royalty never wandered, to a woman who stitched other people's elegance with hands too rough to ever wear it. Her mother, Jeanne Bécu, worked in the shadows of privilege sewing hems for mistresses, embroidering initials onto corsets she'd never own, mending the garments of women who would never learn her name. Jeanne never knew her father. His absence wasn't a tragedy. It was simply the way things were. In the corners of Paris where she spent her earliest years, the missing fathers were as common as cobblestones, and just as unremarkable. She grew up near the Rue Neuve Saint-Roch, where the air smelled faintly of bread crust and coal smoke, and the windows opened onto stone courtyards that echoed with the laughter of children who had learned to find delight in very little. Jeanne learned early how to press her back to the wall when the market carts passed too close, how to eat slowly so the hunger wouldn't come back too soon, and how to read a room without needing to speak. She learned how to be quiet, but not invisible. From a young age, she understood something few children do, that beauty, while not a currency in itself, was a key. And Jeanne, by some trick of the gods or mischief of fate, had been given a face that people remembered, not for perfection, but for softness. She had skin that caught candlelight like porcelain, eyes that changed with mood and weather, and a laugh that, even in the roughest corners of Paris, made men glance up from their wine. But beauty, in a world like hers, was not a gift freely given. It was a burden to be watched and managed. There was always the risk that someone would want to take it, keep it, twist it. Her mother tried to protect her, in the only way she knew how, by placing her in service. Jeanne worked first for a milliner, then in a pastry shop, then as a companion to a wealthy widow who needed someone to refill her tea and listen to her complaints. Wherever she went, Jeanne absorbed everything. How to speak without sounding common. How to walk without making a sound. How to flirt just enough to be remembered, but not enough to be punished. She never called it ambition. That would have been too bold. But she did dream. She dreamed of silk that wasn't second-hand, of rooms that smelled like lavender instead of starch, of men who looked at her not with hunger, but with reverence. And though she never said it aloud, not even to herself, she dreamed of being seen, not just looked at, but truly seen, as someone more than the girl who poured the wine or hemmed the skirt or sweetened the pastry glaze. Paris, in those years, was a city on the edge of something violent and bright and inevitable. The court of Louis XV was still dripping in perfume and powdered wigs, but the cracks were already forming beneath its golden surface. Jeanne didn't care about politics. She cared about doors, not the metaphorical kind, but real ones, heavy wooden doors with brass knobs and velvet curtains on the other side. She wanted to be let in, and so she did what girls like her had always done. She smiled. She listened. She moved carefully, and eventually, she met the man who would unlock the gate. His name was Jean-Baptiste du Barry, and he wasn't a nobleman or a poet or a prince. He was something stranger, a supplier of pleasure, a broker of beauty. He collected women the way others collected paintings. And when he met Jeanne, he knew instantly that he had found a masterpiece. He dressed her in better fabric, taught her to speak with more restraint, gave her lessons in how to hold a fan, when to blush, when to pause mid-sentence to let a man lean in closer. It wasn't love, not even close, but it was a transaction that both understood. He would present her to the world like a jewel, and in return, She would play the role that had been written for her, but not even Jean-Baptiste could have known how far that role would carry her. Jeanne was no longer just the seamstress's daughter. Now she was a woman with invitations, with powdered shoulders and painted cheeks and the scent of rosewater clinging to her wrists. She attended salons, laughed at the jokes of dukes, learned the precise tilt of the head that made queens nervous. Her presence, though technically illegitimate in every possible way, began to ripple through corridors that were never meant to echo her name. And then, one day, the king heard of her. Louis XV, once known as the Beloved, was no longer young. His court had lost its shine. His days were filled with routine, his nights with ritual. But when someone mentioned a girl with laughter like wine and eyes like dusk, he was curious. When they said she was unlike the others, not from the bloodlines of ambition or the houses of old titles, he was intrigued. When they said she had no name worth remembering, he remembered it. To meet the king, however, one had to be of noble birth, and Jeanne, still technically the daughter of no one, needed a shortcut. And so, with the stroke of a pen and a farcical marriage to the brother of her benefactor, she became Jeanne du Barry, Comtesse, a countess by legal fiction, a mistress by royal favour, a scandal by mourning. The girl who had once been asked to serve tea now stood before the most powerful man in France, wearing diamonds that still remembered the necks they came from. The court gasped. The salons sneered. Marie Antoinette herself refused to speak to her. But Jeanne smiled. And that smile, trained in silence and sharpened by survival, was impossible to ignore. She had made it. She was inside the palace, dancing on marble that once scraped her knees when she was scrubbing it. She had found her way into the story, not through lineage or marriage, but through wit, beauty, and an unyielding softness that had somehow survived it all. But stories like hers do not rest easily. Versailles was a place where roses bloomed and withered in the same breath, where the same candle that warmed a room could set it ablaze. Jeanne had stepped into a world that fed on novelty and discarded its queens as quickly as it crowned them. And though she had arrived like no one before her, the world would not let her stay untouched. Her tale, bright as silk, heavy as pearls, was only beginning. Versailles was never truly silent, even in the stillest hour before dawn, when the chandeliers hung motionless and the echo of silk footsteps had long faded from the halls. The palace still hummed. The air itself carried the murmurs of ambition and discontent, laughter stretched too thin, and secrets too delicate to survive the sunlight. And when Jeanne du Barry arrived, not through inheritance or marriage, but by invitation of desire, the whispers grew louder. She had walked through the gilded gates as a countess, in name only, wrapped in borrowed nobility and perfumed with speculation. The marble corridors of Versailles had seen queens come and go, but they were not prepared for someone like her, a woman who neither apologized for her origins nor attempted to disguise them. Jeanne did not pretend to be anything but what she was: beautiful, clever, and uninvited. And yet, she smiled as though she belonged. And in time, the palace began to reshape itself around her presence. The King Louis XV was not young when Jeanne stepped into his gaze, but he was still a man with hunger in his heart. His court, once vibrant, had become stagnant with ritual and etiquette. The excitement of his youth faded into the lace collars of aging, ministers, and tired games of diplomacy. Jeanne, with her laughter that spilled like red wine and eyes that flickered with a kind of earned softness, brought warmth into rooms that had long gone cold. She amused him, certainly, but more than that, she reminded him of something he thought he had misplaced years ago, a feeling, or perhaps the illusion of one, that life could still surprise him. Their relationship was never a secret. It was declared in silence and confirmed by every sideways glance, every lowered head, every pause in conversation as she entered the room. Jeanne became a fixture, as much a part of Versailles as the tapestries and the ticking of the grand clock in the Hall of Mirrors. But unlike the relics of court, she was living, breathing, and stirring unrest with every gesture. Not everyone welcomed her rise. The courtiers, bred on bloodlines and alliances older than the king himself, bristled at the sight of her. They whispered behind gloved hands and lace fans, inventing cruel names for her in their salons. La Catine, La Putain Royale. They smirked as they recited her past, as if shame could undo the present. Jeanne, however, wore their disdain like a second perfume familiar. Sharp, and ultimately powerless, she had survived worse than whispers. Among her fiercest critics was a girl newly arrived from Austria, not yet crowned, but already the focus of every eye in France. Marie Antoinette, barely a teenager, and full of a queen's pride. The Dauphine refused to speak to Jeanne, to look at her, to acknowledge that someone outside the sacred circle of birth could exist within the king's favour. Their cold war of glances and silences would last for years. A battle waged, not with weapons, but with avoidance. But Jeanne had no interest in politics. She did not scheme. She did not plot. She did not install allies or manipulate councils. She had no titles to bestow, no armies to command. What she offered the king was simpler, but in its own way, to far more dangerous comfort. And that comfort threatened a court built on the artifice of importance. She brought light to his days and distraction to his nights. She filled the empty spaces with stories, jokes, music, and the scent of lavender oil. When he was ill, she sat beside his bed, not as a courtesan, but as a woman who had once soothed a mother's aching hands, who knew how to fold linen and speak softly in the dark. The king, in turn, gave her jewels, estates, and a chateau of her own. But she never looked happier than when he laughed. Her power was not the kind that could be signed into law. It existed in the fleeting moments between dusk and dinner, in the glint of a diamond hairpin, in the tilt of a head that made an entire room pause. It was not official, but it was real, and that made it unbearable to those who had chased influence their whole lives, only to be undone by a woman who had never been invited to the table. And yet, Jeanne never tried to be queen. She did not reach beyond what was given. She did not usurp or undermine. She played her role with grace, staying always just enough in the background to seem harmless, and just visible enough to remain unforgettable. She funded artists. She gave coin to the poor. She sent letters asking mercy for those the king might have condemned. These were not grand gestures. They were quiet ones, private, often unknown to anyone but the recipient. But they revealed something the court refused to believe, that perhaps, beneath the silks and scandals, Jeanne Bécu had a heart. Still, Versailles is not a place where softness survives for long. The king's health began to falter. He grew pale, restless, subject to long silences and bouts of melancholy. Jeanne remained beside him, even as the court pulled away, waiting for the inevitable shift. She nursed him through fevers, read to him when he could no longer follow conversation, stayed awake while others slept. But in the end, death answers to no mistress. And in the spring of 1774, Louis XV died of smallpox. His skin marred, his body weakened, and his court already whispering of succession. Jeanne was banished from Versailles the very next day. There was no trial, no scandal, no farewell, just a carriage waiting at dawn and orders not to return. She was sent first to a convent, then permitted to retire to her estate at Louveciennes. The silks were folded away, the jewels locked in velvet boxes, the rooms quiet once more. And the woman who had once made Versailles breathe found herself once again outside the gates, as she had been at the beginning. But she was not the same girl who had arrived through borrowed titles and perfumed promises. She had been loved. She had been hated. She had seen the inside of power, and found it cold and golden and strangely lonely. Still, she had no bitterness. Or if she did, she wore it well. At Versailles, Jeanne surrounded herself with music, art, and the rustle of trees that did not care what names people called her. She walked her gardens at dusk, spoke to the servants as equals, and lived with the quiet elegance of someone who no longer needed to prove she belonged. And had history stopped there, perhaps that would have been her ending a soft exile, a gentle fade into memory. But history, as you and I know, rarely lets women like Jeanne disappear so easily. The world outside Versailles was changing. The whispers had turned to shouts, the salons to mobs. The revolution had begun, and it would not stop for sympathy. To the new France, Jeanne was no longer a woman. She was a symbol, a relic of decadence, a painted reminder of everything that had rotted behind gold-trimmed doors. And in time, they came for her. Some women fade gently into history, like candlelight into dawn, their stories softening with time, their names spoken in sighs. But Jeanne was not made for that kind of forgetting. She had entered the world with too much light, too much softness, too much laughter, too much presence for those who preferred their memories quiet. And in a France that was rapidly setting fire to all it had once worshipped, light was no longer welcome. At Versailles, the days had become tender things. The gardens she once strolled in embroidered gowns now heard the hush of slippered footsteps, the pages of a book turning slowly under morning sun, the soft clinking of porcelain teacups set down with care. The world outside was growing louder, angrier, more brittle by the month. But inside her estate, Jeanne lived as though she could still bargain with peace. Perhaps she believed that having already lost a king, she had nothing left that revolution could take. But even the quietest woman can be made loud by the echo of her past. It began, as such things often do, not with a knock at the door, but with a whisper. Someone had spoken her name. She was accused not of treason, not at first, but of sentiment, that she had written letters to England, sans jouer la brode, retained friendships with enemies of the new republic. None of these things were crimes a few years earlier, but now, even beauty could be considered suspicious, and a past wrapped in silk could be proof enough of betrayal. The one who first gave her name to the Committee of Public Safety was a boy she had once raised, Zamur. She had found him as a child, foreign, alone, purchased into servitude, and gifted to her as one might gift an ornament. And yet she had never treated him as such. She clothed him, educated him, gave him rooms and tutors, and the strange tenderness of someone who remembered what it felt like to be small and unwanted. But in the new France, kindness could not erase origins, and he, like many, had learned to survive by aligning with fury. When questioned, Jeanne did not beg. Not at first, she answered with dignity, wrapped in black mourning silk, still walking with the grace that had once quieted rooms. But the trial was not for justice, it was for theatre, and the crowd was not there for truth, but for blood. They asked her about her jewels. She said they had been gifts. They asked about her letters. She said they were foolish, not treasonous. They asked about the king, and here, her voice faltered not from guilt, but from memory. I loved him, she said, and in that moment, it was clear to everyone that no lie would save her. The verdict was swift. She was sentenced to death by guillotine. The woman who had once walked Versailles in satin shoes and diamond earrings would now walk barefoot to the scaffold. On the morning of December 8th, 1793, Paris was grey. The sky held the kind of dull stillness that seems to listen. Jeanne rose early. Her hair, once powdered and piled, hung loose. Her dress was plain. Her wrists, bound gently with cord, trembled not from fear alone, but from the shock of it all. It was as though she still expected someone to step forward. Someone to say, "There has been a mistake." But no one came. The cart that carried her moved slowly through streets. She once strolled as a queen of shadows. The people gathered, but they were quiet, not out of respect. Revolution rarely makes room for reverence, but out of discomfort. They expected defiance. She gave them sorrow. At the foot of the scaffold, she hesitated. Her knees buckled slightly as she stepped onto the platform. Not for show, not for pity. Just the simple failing of legs that once danced. Now asked to stand for something final. Her eyes scanned the crowd. She whispered words that no one could hear. Perhaps a prayer. Perhaps a plea. Perhaps she was looking for one familiar face to remind her that she had once been more than this moment. The executioner reached for her shoulder, but she flinched, not from pain, but from the weight of finality. And then, tears. Not loud, not dramatic, just the kind that slip out when dignity has reached its end. She turned to him and said this part they remembered. "One more moment. Please. Just a moment. But time, once so generous to her, refused." They say she screamed as the blade fell. Others say she fell silent. Both may be true. Sometimes, even light makes no sound when it leaves. Afterward, the square returned to its rhythm. The crowds dispersed. The scaffold was cleaned. Another name was crossed from the lists. But Versailles did not forget. The roses she had planted still bloomed along the path she once walked. Her letters, many of them burned, survived only in fragments. Her jewels, scattered. Her portrait, taken down, but her story soft, stubborn, shining remained, passed on in whispers. Long after the whispers at Versailles had gone quiet, Jeanne du Barry had been too much for a world that wanted women to be less, too kind for a court that preferred cruelty, too radiant for a time that feared the feminine. And in the end, perhaps that was her crime. Not who she loved, not where she came from, but how she endured, long after the blade had fallen and the crowds had gone home. After the echoes of revolution settled into silence, and the names shouted from balconies faded into dust, there remained only the question that every life leaves behind. However softly it once passed, what stays not the silks, not the titles, not even the portraits, for they are easily painted over. What stays is the breath someone left in a room, the weight of a smile carried in memory, the warmth of a voice someone once tried to remember just before sleep. Jeanne Madame du Barry was not born with the promise of legacy. But even so, she left behind something harder to erase than a name, a presence. And perhaps that is what the world struggles with most. Not the scandal of her story, but the intimacy of it. How she was never quite distant enough to be a myth. How she loved and laughed and grieved, not like the heroines of marble statues, but like the woman next door. Like someone you might have known had time been folded differently. Her hands were not made of ivory. They stitched. They wiped tears. They trembled. And in the end, that is what made her unforgettable, not perfection. But closeness, history, of course, tried to clean her up or write her out. The men who had once toasted her at banquets offered silence after the storm. The women who had watched her with narrowed eyes claimed victory in her fall. The courtiers returned to their games, as if her presence had been a mistake corrected. But you and I, we know better. Because even tonight, as the world sleeps and the stars look down on 1,000 forgotten graves, we are still speaking her name. And that, in itself, is rebellion. What does it mean to live a life that ends in shame, but begins in nothing, and blossoms into something too bright for the age that bore it? Perhaps Jean's story is not about falling, but about rising into a world that was never built to hold her. A world that punished her not for her sins, but for the audacity of surviving beauty without permission. She did not follow the rules. She danced around them. She did not ask for place. She made one, and yet there is something heartbreakingly gentle in her softness. The way she cried at her end was not weakness but memory, memory of gardens, of laughter behind drawn curtains, of the silk slippers she had once removed quietly before stepping into the king's chamber. Her tears were not for her death, but for the sweetness that had once surrounded her like perfume. Now, slipping away like the last notes of a song, no one would hum aloud again. There are historians who write of her as a symbol of excess, a cautionary tale wrapped in diamonds. But bedtime is not for their voices. Bedtime is for what lingers beneath the surface, the pulse beneath the powdered skin, the girl who picked wildflowers on the outskirts of Paris, the woman who watched candlelight dance on gilded ceilings and wondered how long she would be allowed to stay, the human being who, in her final breath, asked not for mercy, not for forgiveness, but simply for time, just one more moment. What she received instead was eternity. Not in monuments, but in memory, not in books, but in whispers, not in marble, but in dream. Jeanne du Barry, in the end, did not vanish. She transformed into legend, into lullaby, into the quiet defiance of women who arrive where they are not invited, smile anyway, and stay long enough to be remembered. And maybe, tonight, that is enough. Maybe it is enough to know that the world can take away everything, jewels, titles, laughter, to even breath, but it cannot take away the echo of a life that was once lived so fully, so tenderly, that even silence bends to listen. So if you are lying in the dark now, somewhere far from Versailles, and long past the hour when tea is poured and wigs are powdered, you know this Jean's story is not one of failure, but of fire, quiet fire, gentle light, the kind that warms rather than burns. You do not need to be royalty to be radiant. You do not need permission to be remembered. And you, like her, may walk through the world with softness and strength, braided tightly together, leaving behind a trail of beauty that no blade can ever cut away. Sleep. Now, let her walk the halls of your dreams. Not as a mistress, not as a sinner, not even as a saint, but as herself. A girl no one invited, a woman everyone remembered, and in the silence between your breaths, you might hear her laughter faint, unbothered, just beyond the veil of sleep. She's not asking for anything now, only that you remember she was here, and that maybe, in some quiet part of your heart, you believe she still is. It is a strange thing, how a place remembers, long after its inhabitants have turned to dust, long after the laughter has quieted and the windows have closed. A house, a garden, a stretch of stone path still knows, and Louveciennes her sanctuary, her exile, her final home remembered Jeanne du Barry. There, on the terraced hillsides west of Paris, where the Seine curved lazily like a ribbon left unfastened. The days once moved slowly, like syrup poured from a golden spoon. The chateau at Louveciennes was not Versailles. It did not echo with the sound of trumpets or carry the weight of kings. It was not born of conquest or crowned with ceremony. It was, instead, a place for breathing, a house, with more windows than walls, more birdsong than gossip, more solitude than spectacle. And Jeanne, for all her silk and scandal, had longed for just such a place, long before she ever stood beside a throne. They said she had designed the rose gardens herself, choosing every colour, every curve of the hedge, every pale marble statue tucked between blossoms. She preferred soft pinks, the kind that reminded her of powder on the cheekbones of noble women, of the faint blush on the lips of women in love. She liked to walk the gravel paths barefoot when no one was watching, her slippers abandoned beneath a stone bench, her skirts lifted just enough to keep them from trailing dew. These were the things no one at court ever saw. And perhaps for that reason, they were the most real. In the quiet of the countryside, without mirrors or monarchs, she began to learn the shape of herself. Not the mistress, not the countess, not the puppet pulled gently on diamond strings, but the girl who once knelt beside her mother's sewing table, threading needles with tiny fingers and whispering dreams into the seams of borrowed fabric. She returned to that girl in Louveciennes, not entirely, but just enough to remember that her softness had always preceded her scandal. The servants who remained called her Madame still, though they no longer needed to, out of habit, perhaps, or reverence. Or maybe they simply understood something that the world had forgotten, that titles are not always inherited. Sometimes they are earned in silence. She did not ask them to lower their voices or bow or curtsy. She asked them about their families. She gave them days off on feast days. She visited the kitchens, and when the revolution began to thunder in the distance, she whispered to her steward, "We must be kind while we still can." And she was, even to those who would later abandon her. It is easy to paint Jeanne's final years in sorrow, but that would be too simple, and she was never a woman of simple endings. There was laughter still soft, cautious, like laughter that has learned its limits, but refuses to vanish. There were letters from old friends who no longer dared sign their names. There were books she reread each winter, their pages worn at the corners. There were rooms she left undisturbed, filled with sunlight and silence, and the faint memory of perfume that never quite faded. But even at Louveciennes, the world outside crept closer. The revolution did not arrive all at once. It came in ripples, a whisper in the village square, a new law passed in Paris, a name scratched off a wall, a friend who stopped writing. She felt it in the way the wind shifted, in the sudden absence of music from nearby homes, in the way people looked at her no longer with envy, but with unease. And then came the knocking. Not loud, not angry, just final. Zamor, the boy she had once lifted from the hands of merchants and placed in the arms of music teachers and tailors, the child she had clothed and fed and loved with a care that never asked for gratitude, stood before the revolutionary tribunal and confirmed what they already believed, that Madame du Barry belonged to a world that must be burned. She did not blame him, at least, not aloud. She knew what fear could do to loyalty. She had lived long enough to see kindness traded for safety and memory bartered for survival. And still, as they took her from her home, her eyes lingered not on the guards, nor the road ahead, but on the roses. They were still blooming. She was not a fool. She knew what awaited her in Paris. She had seen the tumbrils, had heard the stories of friends who vanished into prisons and never returned. And yet, she held herself upright, wrapped in a black shawl that smelled faintly of lavender and old lace, and spoke only when spoken to. She answered with precision, with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to hide, and everything left to feel. They asked her if she regretted her time at court. She did not answer, not because the answer was yes, but because it would never fit into the mouth of a courtroom. They asked her why she wrote to enemies of the Republic. She said nothing, because the real reasons for love, for longing, for reaching out to anyone who once saw you as more than a headline, could never survive in rooms that demanded slogans. Her trial was brief. Her name became theatre, and in the end, it was not Jeanne they condemned, but what she represented: a world of velvet and violets and too many mirrors. A woman who dared to be remembered for beauty when the world had chosen anger, but Louveciennes, even in her absence, remembered differently. Years passed. The revolution consumed itself. The kings returned, then vanished again. France changed her face, her laws, her language, and Louveciennes waited. The gardens grew wild. The marble cracked. The roof groaned beneath winter snow. But the roses somehow remained. Spring, without asking permission. They bloomed. Visitors came, quiet ones, not scholars, not soldiers, but dreamers. They walked the same paths. She once strolled barefoot, knelt beside the same rose bushes, touched the faded stone of the benches where she once read poetry to no one but the wind. And some claimed that at dusk, just as the sun vanished beyond the trees, you could almost hear her footsteps soft, deliberate, familiar. Not a ghost, not a legend, just the memory of a life too vivid to forget. Jeanne du Barry was not made for history books. She was not a heroine, nor a villain. She was not a cause, nor a warning. She was a woman, a full, breathing, complicated woman who loved, who lost, who gave, who asked for more time, and who, in the end, left behind something no executioner could erase a trace. It's in the roses. It's in the silence after laughter. It's in the softness of a question asked just before sleep. And tonight, as the world quiets around you, as your breathing slows and your thoughts settle like dust in an empty hall, perhaps you, too, can feel her there, not watching, not haunting, just being still, present. Enough. History often forgets that silence is not absence, it is space. And in the long hush that followed Jeanne du Barry's final breath, something lingered. Not her voice, for that was gone. Not her body, for the blade had taken it. What remained was a kind of outline, a shape drawn in memory, in longing, in resistance. The world had tried to erase her, but in doing so, it carved out the space into which other women would step, carrying flickers of her fire. They did not speak her name aloud. Not at first. It was too dangerous, too decadent, too feminine for a new world that wanted to be built on blood and steel, instead of perfume and poetry. But the women who came after her knew, in their quiet rebellions, in the softness they refused to abandon, in the grace they offered to a world that did not ask for it, they knew. They carried her inside them, like a secret stitched into the hem of an old gown. Something tender, something defiant. In the drawing rooms of post-revolutionary Paris, where candles once again flickered beside books of verse and the smell of jasmine returned to windowsills, there were women who leaned too far into mirrors, who wore colour too boldly, who dared to laugh too easily. They were not queens. They were not always noble, but they were radiant. And the people around them, mostly men, whispered with the same tone they once reserved for Jeanne, not because these women threatened order, but because they disturbed expectation. They made beauty political again. Jeanne had never claimed to be more than what she was. She had not schemed like Pompadour. She had not ruled. She had not advised in council or manipulated treaties. But what she had done, quietly, without agenda, I was proved that being adored was itself a kind of influence. And so, in the centuries that followed, long after the echo of revolution had faded into textbooks, that truth remained like a perfume you catch on someone walking past unexpected, disarming, and familiar. There was a duchess in the court of Napoleon who ordered her gowns to resemble the ones Jeanne had worn at Louvciennes, not out of vanity, but because she had read somewhere that Madame du Barry had once said, "The body is not shameful. Shame comes from those who punish joy." That duchess would be scandalized for dancing barefoot in a marble salon one summer evening. And yet, even in disgrace, she would whisper to a confidante, "At least I was free." There was a painter in the salons of the Restoration who painted women not as allegories but as themselves, eyes meeting the gaze of the viewer, lips parted as if mid-sentence. His portraits were dismissed as vulgar, too real, but he defended them, saying, "Why should a woman's softness not be strength?" And if one looked closely at the background of his most infamous canvas, One might notice a rose faint, nearly transparent, resting in a porcelain bowl, a quiet homage to Louveciennes. And there were letters. Of course. So many letters, hidden in boxes beneath floorboards, in the margins of diaries, in the pages of forgotten novels. Women writing to other women about the ache of being seen and still misunderstood, about being touched but not known, about choosing laughter over obedience. Jeanne's name appeared not always as a subject, but as a verb, as a mood, as a kind of light. I had a du Barry moment last night. One girl wrote in a summer boarding school near Marseille, "I wore my dress too low." And I didn't apologize. But even as the world softened its view of her, even as historians began to speak of her, not with scorn but with curiosity, there remained the ache of what could have been, because Jeanne du Barry had not been allowed to age, to transform, to grow into the kind of woman whose voice is taken seriously not because it shouts, but because it endures. Her life had been folded in half. Her story cut before its final pages could be written. And yet, those unwritten pages were not empty. They were lived by others. There was a girl in Vienna who read about Jeanne in secret, and later wrote a symphony under a man's name, saying, "I write the way she walked uninvited, but with intention." There was a widow in Lyon who painted her parlour pink and refused to explain herself to anyone. There was a courtesan in London who carried a small locket with Jeanne's portrait inside, not for worship, but for memory. "So I don't forget," she said once, "that softness is not surrender, even in the age of factories and telegrams, when lace gave way to starch and romance bowed to efficiency." The outline of Jeanne's life could still be traced. A woman in a bookstore, brushing dust from a forgotten memoir, a girl in a library corner, hiding a candle beneath her skirts to finish the chapter before curfew, an old woman folding a silk scarf she hadn't worn in decades, smiling to herself as though remembering something no one else could see. And in that way, Jeanne was never truly gone, because what she offered was not a model to copy, but a permission to feel deeply, without shame, to love foolishly, to laugh too loud, to cry in front of strangers, to ask for time, to believe that pleasure could be pure, that beauty could be healing, and that being fully alive was not a thing to apologize for. These are not political acts in the way revolutions are. They don't rewrite laws, but they rewrite something quieter, the way a girl sees herself in a mirror, the way a woman answers a question meant to diminish her, the way a life, however brief, can become a lighthouse in the fog of what the world expects and what the heart knows. So if, in your own life, you've ever hesitated before stepping into a room, wondering whether you belong, remember her. Remember the girl who was not invited to the ball, who walked in anyway. Remember the woman who stood at the edge of history's scorn and chose to live with softness intact. Remember that being seen and still choosing joy is not vanity, it is courage. Jeanne du Barry left behind no daughters, but she left behind descendants of spirit, and they are everywhere. In poems, in petal, in the pause between music and memory. In you, there is a quiet danger in remembering someone only in absolutes. History loves to divide its women into categories: saint or seductress, muse or manipulator, victim or villain. But Jeanne du Barry never lived her life according to such simple boundaries. And to honor her now as softly as a sigh settling on your pillow, we must allow her to be more than one thing at once. Because she was kind, she was cruel, she was generous in ways that shocked those who expected her to hoard, and she was selfish in ways that revealed how deeply she had learned to survive. She gave away fortunes and kept grudges. She forgave what should have broken her, and broke when no one was watching. She was graceful in public, and sometimes unbearably sharp in private. She could ruin you with a glance and save you with a gesture. And it is within these contradictions, not beyond them, that her humanity lives. To pretend otherwise is to flatten her into something she never was a symbol. She was not a symbol. She was a woman, and like all women made of breath and bone. She was shaped by the hands that held her, the eyes that watched her, and the names that clung to her whether she wore them willingly or not. There are stories they told to diminish her, how she took lovers too easily, how she spent gold too quickly, how she flirted too publicly, how she enjoyed being adored. But tell me if a man in her position had done the same. Would it have been scandal or power? Jeanne understood what so many feared to admit, that beauty could be currency, and she learned to spend it. But she never traded her soul, and that is no small thing in a world built to consume softness. She once gave a pearl necklace to a laundress whose daughter was sick, without being asked, without a word of thanks, expected. She once ordered an entire shipment of silk gowns to be sewn by apprentices, just so the poorest seamstresses in Paris could have work in winter. She wrote letters for aging courtiers, who could no longer write for themselves. She paid for the funeral of a poet who had once called her vulgar, and she did these things quietly, knowing they would never be spoken of in court, gossip, or captured in portraits. She also held grudges. She also lied. She once had a servant dismissed for breaking a vase she disliked anyway. She once whispered about a rival's powdered wig not matching her skin tone, and laughed too loudly when others joined in. She could be unkind. When cornered, she could be vain. When unsure, and she could be reckless with the emotions of those who loved her, as though she did not believe she deserved to be loved in return. But isn't that also human? To test love because you've known too much loss, to shield tenderness because you've seen how it is punished, to push others away because you are certain they will leave anyway. Jeanne was not a saint. She never claimed to be. But in a world that demanded sainthood from its women, while forgiving anything in its men, her refusal to wear a halo became its own kind of resistance. And for that, they called her dangerous. Not because she held a weapon, but because she did not apologize. She did not apologize for being adored. She did not apologize for dressing in color when mourning was expected. She did not apologize for wanting softness when the world only offered sharpness. She did not apologize for surviving again and again and again in rooms that were never meant for her. She lived in a time that measured a woman's worth by who she married, what she inherited, or how quietly she endured. And she did none of those things. Instead, she rose not on the backs of others, but on the force of her own presence, and even now, centuries later, we are still untangling how uncomfortable that makes the world feel. It is tempting, in the hush of bedtime, to speak only of the gentle things, to wrap Jeanne's memory in lavender and lace, and let her rest as a softened ghost of her true self. But that would be another kind of erasure, because she was not only softness, she was sharp, too. Sharp like the edge of a mirror, sharp like the breath caught in the throat when desire meets defiance. She knew how to make a room fall silent with a single look. She knew how to wield attention like a blade. And yes, sometimes she used it to wound, but she also used it to protect. There was a girl she took in once, no name recorded, no title to speak of, just a girl who reminded Jeanne of herself. Years earlier, standing barefoot at the edge of a ballroom she was never meant to enter. Jeanne taught her how to walk, how to speak, how to command space without shrinking. She gave her lessons not in grammar or scripture, but in survival. The world will tell you that your softness is your flaw. She once told the girl, let them believe it, then show them it's your weapon. We do not know what became of that girl, but perhaps she, too, passed the lesson on. Perhaps it is still being whispered. Even now, not all legacy is written in stone. Some is written in the way a woman steps into a room she was told to avoid. Some is written in the way a voice doesn't shake when asked to explain itself. Some is written in the simple act of being fully, unapologetically oneself. And that, in the end, is what Jeanne gave us. Not a perfect story, But a real one. She was not flawless. She was not forgettable. And she was not afraid. Even when fear would have been easier, she walked toward her end, trembling. Yes, but not silent. She begged for more time. Yes, but not because she regretted living, because she wasn't finished. And in some ways, she still isn't. Because every time a woman refuses to shrink, Jeanne lives again. Every time a girl dares to be more than what she was born into, Jeanne walks beside her. Every time someone chooses softness instead of shame, elegance instead of explanation, joy instead of apology, Jeanne breathes, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a mirror, not a saint, not a sinner, just a woman. And that is more than enough. Houses, if you let them, remember, they hold on longer than we do, not to the noise of life, but to its weight, the invisible impressions left behind like warmth in a chair just vacated, like the perfume that clings to lace, even after decades folded in a drawer. And Louvciennes, the little chateau nestled in the hills west of Paris, remembered her. It did not remember her the way statues do, stiff and cold, demanding reverence. No, it remembered her gently. It remembered the way her voice lifted when she hummed to herself in the garden just before sunset. It remembered how her slippers tapped unevenly when she danced alone in the drawing room, pretending not to watch herself in the glass. It remembered the scent of her skin, mingled with orange blossom and powdered sugar, and how it lingered in the corridor long after she had left the room. When the gates of Louvciennes closed behind her for the final time, the house did not sigh or creak in protest. It waited. The curtains remained drawn at the same angle. The mirror above the fireplace kept her reflection for as long as it could. The roses in the garden, left untended, bloomed anyway as if they, too, could not forget her. She had spoken to them as she watered them, not as a queen speaks to her subjects, but as one woman might whisper to another, and though they could not answer, they remembered. Years passed, then decades, then more. The revolution took everything from Jeanne, the jewels, the titles, the letters, the laughter, but it could not take her shape from Louvciennes. Not entirely. People came and went. Families bought the property. Servants changed hands. New names were written into ledgers. Paintings were taken down or replaced. But still, something of her remained. There was a room at the top of the stairs, the blue room. They called it not because of its walls, which had long since faded, but because of the way the light spilled across the floor in the mornings, cool and soft, like a secret. Visitors who slept there often dreamed of parties they had never attended, of staircases they had never climbed, of a woman with two bright eyes and a voice like music beneath water. They never knew her name, but they remembered her long after leaving, and that was enough. In the cellar, there were boxes no one dared open, though none could say why. A broken teacup wrapped in linen, a comb missing half its teeth, a velvet ribbon still knotted, as if it had just been untied. Useless things, ordinary things, and yet they pulsed faintly with something unspoken. Jeanne had not been a queen, but she had been adored and loved. Once it's soaked into a place, doesn't drain away easily. At the base of the west window, the floorboards still creaked in the same way they did when she would pace late into the night. She had always walked there when the letters from Paris arrived, when Louis wrote, or when he didn't. When the news from Versailles left her breathless with hope or hollow with knowing, the pacing had soothed her. The rhythm reminded her that she was real, that the world could not erase her, so long as she kept moving, and even after her feet stopped. The floor remembered. It sang back her footsteps in ghostly echo, just for itself. Children who visited the house centuries later would ask strange questions. Who's the lady in the mirror? Why do the roses grow in a circle? Was this where the sad girl lived? their parents would hush them, brush the questions away with nervous laughter. But the house heard. It always heard, and in some quiet, invisible way. It answered. There is no monument to Jeanne at Versailles, no marble bust, no commemorative plaque. Her name is not carved into stone, and no dates are etched beside it. And still, it is her house, not by law or deed, but by memory, the kind of memory that seeps into wallpaper and waits there, patient and unseen, until the right person touches the wall and feels something they cannot name. Once, in the late spring of a quiet year, a young woman visited Versailles. She had read of Jeanne only briefly in a novel, or perhaps a rumor that had escaped from a forgotten history book and came not in search of her, but in search of silence. She wandered through the gardens, ran her fingers along the old stone balustrade, and sat beneath the arching pear trees just as the late afternoon light turned everything gold. She did not speak. She simply listened, and later, when she wrote in her notebook, she found herself writing a name she did not know. She remembered Jeanne. The house had spoken to her, not loudly, not clearly, but kindly, because that is what Versailles had learned from Jeanne, that a woman need not be loud to be heard, nor royal to be remembered, nor perfect to be loved. She had not filled the chateau with proclamations. She had filled it with presence, with sighs, with light, with the quiet sort of beauty that lingers longer than chandeliers and outlasts every scandal. And that beauty remains, even as the seasons turn, even as the world forgets, even as the roads leading to Versailles become crowded with newer names, newer lives, newer dramas. Because while history busies itself with empires and revolutions, the house remembers something simpler. It remembers her perfume rising in the heat of summer. It remembers the sound of laughter from the bath she had installed with too many candles. It remembers the blue ribbon caught once in a tree branch and left there like a little flag of joy. And most of all, it remembers how she made it feel less like a fortress and more like a home, a place where someone once exhaled deeply and believed, if only for a moment, that she was safe. There is always a moment just before the dream takes hold, just before the last thread of waking thought slips quietly away, when the mind drifts not toward what was loudest, but toward what was softest. In that gentle descent, history does not shout, it hums. It hums in the voice of a woman once misunderstood, once cast aside, and never quite erased. It hums in the lingering presence of Jeanne du Barry. Not the scandal, not the whispers, not the guillotine, but the woman, the real one. It is tempting to ask, even now, what she meant, whether she changed anything, whether it mattered, in the end, that she loved velvet and roses, that she walked uninvited into rooms meant to deny her, that she dared to be fully alive in a world that wished her invisible. But perhaps that question belongs not to Jeanne, nor to history, but to you, here, in the stillness of night, as the story begins to fold itself into the shape of memory, because in the end, we do not carry people with us in their titles or their punishments or their crimes. We carry them in gestures. We carry them in the softness of a hand brushing across fabric, in the sudden sparkle of a smile that rises not from joy, but from defiance, in the way someone's laughter, long ago, lives inside a room like a ghost who never learned how to leave. And that is where Jeanne belongs now, not on the scaffold, not in the shadow of Versailles, but here, in that quiet place between breath and forgetting, where stories become lullabies, and even the most misunderstood lives find a gentler ending. If you could see her now, you wouldn't see a mistress or a martyr. You would see a woman sitting alone at a dressing table, long after the candles have burned low, unpinning her hair, slowly, quietly, not because anyone is watching, But because it is time to be herself again, you would see the curve of her back in the mirror, not broken by grief, but curved from the weight of living. You would hear her whisper something, maybe a prayer, maybe a memory, maybe nothing at all, and you would understand that this, too, is history. The unwitnessed part, the part that mattered most. In that final year, they say she stopped wearing bright colours. She chose soft blues and greys, not in mourning, but in peace. Her laughter was rarer, but when it came, it was whole. She spent hours in the garden, not tending, just being. There was no audience left, and she didn't seem to mind. Her life no longer needed applause. When the summons came, when the world she had once adorned turned its back fully and finally, she did not resist the way they expected. There was no scream, no collapse, no curse hurled at the heavens, just a breath, long and deliberate, just a turning of the head, as if she had heard something faint and far away, just the steps forward, into history's waiting hands. And yet, as the tumbril rolled through the streets of Paris, as her name was spoken not with admiration, but with judgment, there was something else. There was a child, somewhere on the edge of the crowd, who would remember not the sentence, but the colour of her shawl. There was a baker who would whisper, "She once gave my wife her earrings when we had nothing." There was a prison guard who would say, years later, "She cried like anyone would, but she stood taller than I've ever seen anyone stand." And maybe that is how we carry her now. Not in the grandeur, not in the tragedy, but in the in-between, in the way someone who has been broken chooses, somehow, to remain kind, in the way someone who has been seen only as beautiful finds strength in not being looked at all, in the way a story, once too scandalous to repeat, becomes instead a song hummed to those who need it. So as you lie here now, wrapped in the warmth of sleep's approach, let her rest beside you, not as a ghost, but as a guest. Let her sit at the foot of your bed, not to speak, but simply to be. Let her remind you that every person you've ever heard misjudged or misunderstood was once a child, once a dreamer, once someone who wanted nothing more than to be loved without condition. Let her remind you that softness is not the opposite of strength, and that endings, real endings, are never final. They are just quieter than we expect. Tonight, Versailles sleep. The roses bloom. The blue room holds its silence, and somewhere, in the folds of shadow, where memory curls into myth, Jeanne du Barry removes her last ribbon, unbuttons the final clasp, and exhales. She does not need a crown. She does not need your forgiveness. She has waited long enough. Let her sleep. And while she does, so may you,